All right. I want to go ahead and get started. So if I can have your attention. All right. So technically this is now Unit 2, which is to say we've kind of moved on from Reconstruction. And now we've moved into this chapter that's about industrialization and westward expansion of the nation. Okay? It might seem like this reading is just like all the others. In some respects it is. It is, focused on race. But very importantly, it is also focused on industrialization. And by industrialization, I mean the introduction, the expansion of large-scale industry, heavy industry, like coal mines and iron mines and large-scale agriculture, various other kinds of industries that were popping up in the South. And of course, there are a number of reasons why this is important to look at industrialization, and we'll flesh this out. But one of the best reasons you can find for explaining how the Old South, which was, of course, the South under slavery, how the Old South, which was almost completely agricultural, becomes by, let's say, the beginning of the 19th century, or 20th century, early 20th century, so you're talking after 1900, becomes actually a fairly industrialized society. So it becomes industrial and agricultural. And we call that the New South. Now, as you recall from the first unit, the New South is also characterized by Jim Crow and segregation. Okay? So you've already come up against the characteristics of the New South as far as civil rights goes. Basically what happens, as is outlined again even in this chapter, basically what happens is that Reconstruction gives way to a period of 10 to 15 years where a kind of struggle ensues between blacks who still are enfranchised in the South and whites who are now re-enfranchised in the South, a struggle that ultimately codifies or puts into law legal segregation. Or stated differently, a new social system. And I want you to realize that segregation and Jim Crow are in fact not slavery. Stated differently, slavery meant that all of you, if I were a slave owner and you were slaves, I owned you. I could do whatever I wanted to with you. You are my property. I can work you. I can not work you. I can work some of you in the house. I can work some of you in the fields. I can take advantage of you sexually if I want to. I can beat you. I can discipline you in other ways. And the law allows me to do that. That's codified slavery. That's what slavery was. So that you, as slaves, are, simply stated, my property. And of course, in civil rights terms, you're not human beings. You are not equal with me. I am master. You are slave. That's the Old South. Notice then that under slavery, control of slaves, if not easy, was something I did using my powers to punish and various people who I could get to basically discipline you. Slave drivers, we might call them. Frequently those slave drivers were black. They were not white. Okay? And the point is that slavery allowed me to treat you like you're not a human being. Like you are just a possession. But you are also valuable. You are valuable because you provide for me labor. You provide for me work. You sow my crops. You harvest my crops. Yeah, I have to feed you. I have to house you. But you have value. If you're a hardworking, 24-year-old male, you might be worth as much as $1,200 or $1,500 if I were to try to sell you on the open market. You have value, okay? Remember, of course, that before the outbreak of the Civil War and the 3 decades before the Civil War, some 2 million slaves changed ownership. Okay, and as we talked about the other day, that meant, for instance, if you guys are a family, and I want to sell the mom, I can sell the mom. If I want to sell the child, I can sell the child. If I want to sell the father, I can sell the father. Right? So the point here is that slavery, the system, the Old South, gave me control over your lives in every aspect. Now, as you know from the last reading, you, as slaves, would fill the necessary space between us with your own culture, your own religion, etc., right? So you exercised your agency, as it were, but I still had a lot of power to discipline you, right? Okay. Reconstruction comes along after freedom, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. What's the 13th Amendment bring? Is it Rosa? What's the 13th Amendment grant to these former slaves? No. That would be what? It abolished slavery. That's right. The 13th Amendment abolished the practice of slavery, made slavery illegal in the United States of America. All right? The 14th does what? Alex? The 14th grants what constitutional rights? What's that? You mean equal protection? Yeah. Equal protection under the law. That's right. The 14th Amendment, you didn't mean that. You're pulling my leg. Equal protection under the law, which means that the law applies to you the same way it applies to me, or stated differently, the law should apply to you the same way it applies to me. It should be imposed the same way on me as on you. We're equal in that sense, right? Because we both have equal protection under the law. But it also grants citizenship, right? Citizenship. Very good. So the 14th Amendment grants citizenship, and the 15th Amendment grants what, Christian? Voting rights. Although it doesn't guarantee voting rights, it just prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, creed, or previous condition of servitude. So that in the future, as we will see, laws would be put into effect that allowed for the suppression of the black vote, in spite of the fact that in reality and in theory, the Constitution now granted to these former slaves the freedoms that everybody else is guaranteed under the Constitution. Okay? So in civil rights terms, then, the Old South gives way to freedom. And for 10 or 12 years, from 65 to 77, we have this period of Reconstruction. But then that period comes to an end, basically, when the North and the rest of the country decides that it's time to get on with things. So, for instance, it's time to rescue the economy. We've been at this Civil War thing long enough, people said. You can only focus on this stuff for so long. Let's get on to rebuilding the country. Right? So remember, the broad narrative that we've outlined in the first few readings is that the turn to segregation, I would say the turn back to segregation, but that's not accurate. Because slavery wasn't segregation. Slavery meant we were face to face all the time. Me the master, you the slave. It meant we lived together. We were close. We were so close that I knew your business and you knew my business. Segregation, Jim Crow, is a different kind of social system that says, no, the races should live separately in public space. Which is to say, whites and blacks can live near one another, but in terms of who goes to the theater and where they sit, who rides the train, who uses the water fountain in the park, and which water fountain you use, what public restroom you use, whether you can even go into a restaurant, that kind of thing. That's segregation. That's Jim Crow, right? It's not slavery. And so where we find ourselves in this course is at a transition point where we have gone from slavery to Reconstruction, and now Reconstruction to the New South, which in civil rights terms is characterized by segregation or Jim Crow. But in industrial terms, this is important, but in industrial terms, the New South is an industrialized or an industrializing South. Now, that's important for a number of reasons. We're going to see that. But I want to kind of just illustrate the broader picture here. It is true that many of the rich, white, former plantation-owning, master class aristocrats in the South had a lot of money. And they could use that money to develop their farms or, develop mines, right? Industrialize. But what I want you to see is that industrialization requires capital. And by capital, I mean money. And I mean lots of it. The question is, where is that money going to come from? Now, it might come from the wealth of the previous plantation class. Okay, fine. But there's not nearly enough wealth there, because remember, much of the wealth of the former slave-owning class was based upon the value of you as slaves. Now think about this. If I own all you guys, I got 35 slaves, and you're all worth $100, that's $3,500. It might be you're worth much more than that, but let's just use that round number. I can borrow against you. You are an asset. I can mortgage you. I can borrow money against your value because you are my property. By the way, when you think about dehumanization, when you think about the effects of slavery, this dehumanizing concept is very powerful, right? So I can borrow against you. You have value. What was I going to say? What else was I going to say? But in 1865, March of 1865, when the 13th Amendment is passed, and then 3 weeks later when the Civil War is over, what have I lost? Freedom cost me $3,500. Freedom cost me my labor force. Freedom meant I lost my property. Add on that not only did I lose my property, but I probably lost my political rights in Reconstruction. Stated differently, I didn't have the right to vote because I supported the Confederacy. And if I eventually did get the right to vote, tens of thousands, if not millions, which might be stretching it, hundreds of thousands of former slaves now have the right to vote, and their numbers in multiples much larger than me and my buddies simply outweigh us. So not only have I lost my property, not only has the state, the federal government, come in and taken my business away, but they've taken my labor source, And they've taken my political rights. In the name of, watch this, in the name of protecting black folk. Assuring black folk that the Constitution guarantees their civil rights just the same as it should guarantee my civil rights. Which, by the way, remember, I've been disenfranchised. I don't have that political right anymore. So I have a lot of reason to be angry. Right? Now, I want you guys to think about not just the racial component here, but I want you to think about the dynamics of industrialization and what it means and its impact. Now, back to my original question, where does the money, where does the capital come from to industrialize in the South? A lot of it comes from the North. It's investment capital. Which is to say that if you think of the country as regions, think of this. The North as highly developed and industrialized. Remember, the reason the North won the Civil War wasn't because they had better soldiers, it's because they had more soldiers. It's not because they had better weapons or better tactics, it's because they had more weapons and more industry. And of course, they could bring immigrants in from Ireland and all over the place and basically have them fight in the Civil War. So that the North won, not because their principles were superior, although you might believe that their principles were superior. They won because they were already industrialized. Stated differently, they won because an entire class of business people were successful at industrializing the North over the previous 7, 8, 10 decades in ways the South was not industrialized. The South produced cotton. That's what it did. Which, by the way, was 60% of all exports from the United States was cotton from the South. By the way, where was that cotton sent when it was produced? Some of it was sent over to England. Much of it was sent where? To the north, to Massachusetts.